and I'd like to introduce Megan Doerr. She is the principal scientist in the governance team at Sage Bionetworks. She was a botanist and a middle school teacher in her former life. And then Megan Doerr joined the genetic counseling community in 2006. And then she led the clinical development and implementation of Cleveland Clinic's family history and risk assessment tool before joining the governance team at Sage Bionetworks in 2015. So at Sage, Megan's efforts have been concentrated on supporting innovative, participant-centric approaches in open science. Her work has a strong focus on app-based research, including the ELSI issues associated with informed consent, research participation, and data sharing for secondary use in entirely remote mobile platform-based research studies, including for the All of Us research program. So we are really, really excited to have Megan here join us at the OHRP Lunch and Learn meeting. So the title of today's presentation is Use of E-Consent in Human Subject Research. So let us maybe give Megan a big applause before she starts. Thank you. Thank you, Megan.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to get started. So let me see if I can share my screen and we can get the slides going.
Okay.
Here we go. Make this. All right, can you see the slide view?
Very well, and I'm going to put ourselves on mute as well.
Okay. All right, so I will, I'll just go ahead and start. If you guys have any questions, don't hesitate to unmute yourselves and ask a question, and then we'll have obviously time for more questions at the end. All right, just a quick disclosure slide. I'm co-inventor of Cleveland Clinic's My Legacy intellectual property portfolio, and I'm entitled to royalties and equity because of that. Invention. I receive salary support from several federal grants, including through the All of Us research program. I volunteer for a number of different organizations, including the Global Alliance for Genomics and Health, the Digital Medicine Society, and the National Society of Genetic Counselors. And my presentation today will be informed by a number of sources, including Sage's Elements of Informed Consent, which is an online free resource, and other papers I've written, as well as the papers, presentations, and generous conversation of collaborators near and far. I can't stress enough that it takes a village to create innovation in science, and I'm really thankful for all of the collaborative relationships I have. At the same time, the views that I'm presenting are my own. Just some quick background about Sage Bionetworks. Sage is a nonprofit organization that promotes open science. We receive funding from 3 major sources: competitive grants, charitable foundations, and then a small amount through commercial partnerships. Our team includes researchers and data scientists, community managers, and then we have a whole technology team, security experts, software engineers, and UI and UX designers. And then we have the research ethics and data governance group, which I'm a part of. So here's what I'm going to talk about today. First, I'll be defining e-consent. Then we're going to be talking about the audiences for e-consent, talking about app-mediated research, which is one of the most common applications of e-consent, and then a couple of case examples to illustrate some of the points that I've been trying to make about consent throughout the talk. So let's get started. What is e-consent? So just to remind everyone, and this is like, bringing coal to Newcastle, informed consent for research is a process, not a thing. It needs to be specific, voluntary, and reversible. It's been described by a number of different major documents, including the ones listed here, and obviously it's mandated by law. The most recent revisions to the Common Rule really focus on transparency and participant-centeredness, and I think in this way, e-consent is really a natural next step, or a natural additional tool when we think about modernizing our approaches to informed consent. Because informed consent is really a labor-intensive activity. which doesn't at all scale or represent the type of world we live in now, which is much more like this picture, with everyone having connected digital devices and attentions being splintered all over the place. So how can we use electronic technologies to help us scale research and increase the representativeness and the sample sizes that we gather to allow for appropriate solving? So one possibility is e-consent. So e-consent is, the term is thrown around a lot. When I think about e-consent, I think about e-consent having three major components: the e-consent part of it itself, the long form, and then the privacy policy in terms of service. So we're going to walk through each of these, and I'll tell you a little bit about what each of them are. I think that one of the challenges here is that there's really a lack of standardization about what is considered e-consent, a lack of standardization about the content, about the format, about the approach, about the language, and then obviously there's no regulation that describes e-consent at the federal level at this time. So I'm going to try to flesh it out and give it some definition here for us. So e-consent is basically a highlight reel, and you should be able to see this video playing. This is an example e-consent, one of our first designs that we made here at Sage Bionetworks for one of our first app-mediated research studies. It's usually self-navigated and self-paced, meaning that the participant or prospective participant walks themselves through it. It can be completed remotely or in person with a coordinator by their side. It may include icons or animation or video or voiceover. You can see here that we have some icons that are animated. And it may include a quiz, either a formative or summative assessment, either interspersed throughout the highlight reel or at the end. And we'll talk in more depth about each of these points. And obviously, it helps scale informed consent. Here are some examples of e-consent screens. So you can see a welcome screen, a research description screen or screens, data handling and use screens, issues to consider, which we might otherwise call risks, what's involved, rights, potential risks and benefits, and then a quiz and a long form and a signature. So these tend to be some of the major components that we see in e-consent in the highlight reel part of the e-consent. E-consent can be linear, like the one that the video I just showed you, or it can be nonlinear. So we created this nonlinear navigation for a study that we're doing with people with Alzheimer's disease and their caregivers. And this nonlinear format allows people to follow their own interest and click on the different tiles, learn what's behind the tile, and once they've navigated through all the tiles, then they arrive at the quiz and the form and the signature part of the consent process. This nonlinear navigation allows for adult learners in particular to really follow their own interest. We are studying whether linear or nonlinear navigation is better or worse for participant understanding of the parameters of the study and the retention of those over time. So a note about where you're completing e-consent. So you can complete e-consent in an entirely remote setting, meaning you're not in the clinic at all at any time, or you can come in person and sit down and use a tablet that the clinic provides and complete e-consent there. There are benefits and concerns about each of them. In an entirely remote consent environment, a prospective participant can review as many times as they'd like to without pressure. They can get support from family and friends. They have the time to reflect and think, so there's none of that white coat bias. The challenges, though, are confirming participant eligibility, ensuring that participants' questions are answered completely before they sign up to join the study. Yvonne, did you have a question or a comment?
No, but I think maybe since you stopped, I think that it'd be, my question is, do you have experience about, how people might counter, or what measures can be used to deal with some of these concerns?
Yeah, and I'll walk through those as we keep going here. So, and if I don't get to them and you still have that question, we can circle right back around to it.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and then on the in-person side, there are benefits like staff being present to answer questions in real time, obviously identity confirmation, and also digital translation. You know, we think a lot about language translation, but we don't think about how necessary digital translation is. So to have somebody who is uncomfortable with a digital device, they may need someone sitting with them who's knowledgeable, who can help them navigate so that they feel reassured about the environment that they're doing the consent in, and are focusing less on the digital part of it and more on the content associated with it. Some of the concerns with in-person consent is it just reinforces access limitations. So geographic limitations to your catchment pool for recruitment, people who have difficulty coming into a clinic for whatever reason. And then you also have the white coat bias, the time pressure to say yes. So just a couple more points about zero in-person step. So when we think about people with cognitive decline or cognitive impairment, it really becomes important for us to be deliberate in how we employ e-consent. So if you're employing e-consent in an entirely remote setting with a population who may be experiencing cognitive decline or might have cognitive decline as one of their symptoms, you need to be very deliberate in ensuring that they are sufficiently cognitively intact to be able to consent. And one of the ways to do that is through assessment, through a quiz, which we're going to get to in just a second. For people of low health literacy, by contrast, they are not sitting next to somebody who can translate words on a screen into verbally spoken words with them. So that's why in an entirely remote setting, if you're working with a population that has low health literacy, which I would say describes most of the United States, you'll want to have voiceover or other adaptive technology to help people with the amount of written content you present. Finally, if you're enrolling children in a study and you have zero in-person steps, you have to be even more deliberate with the ways that you reach out and approach the parents who will be consenting, and then the assent of the children associated with those adults. There's a recent publication out in Canada of a trial study of an entirely remote app-based app-mediated research study with e-consent for teenagers. And I am following this actually pretty closely. So they've just published a paper describing the development of their e-consent process, and will now be implementing it. So we'll be watching that with interest. So a little bit more about quizzes. So there's two different approaches that you can take to a quiz. Either a formative evaluation or a summative evaluation. And if you're using e-consent, I would strongly encourage you to include a quiz as part of your e-consent. You can either intersperse the questions throughout the e-consent, or you can place them at the end, before or after the long form. But it allows you to either, in the case of a formative evaluation, do a form of teach-back or reinforcing of key concepts, or with a summative evaluation, create a gate through which people cannot pass unless they have demonstrated mastery. So for most studies that enroll cognitively intact adults, I would say probably a formative evaluation is okay. We don't have any objective standard for autonomous decision-making. So it's not like we can say, well, absolutely people have to be able to answer X, Y, or Z question. If we want to support the true autonomy of adult participants, then we allow them to make decisions about their participation themselves. But the formative evaluation does provide this moment of reflection. So you ask a question, and regardless of if the person gets the question correct or incorrect, you reflect back to them the correct answer. So if they get the answer correct, you would say, ah, yes, correct. The answer is yes, you can withdraw at any time. And if they get the answer incorrect, you would say, you know, you've gotten this question incorrect. You can actually withdraw at any time. Would you like to review that section of the e-consent again? And allow people to learn about the study and reinforce appropriate and correct concepts over time. A summative evaluation, though, is very, very different. We're asking people to answer questions correctly. And one moment, please. Let me turn back on my lights here. The motion sensor of my office is behind the screen here. Sorry about that. So, so a summative evaluation is really used to measure mastery. And so you get participants to these questions, and then if they can't answer the questions correctly, then they cannot join the study, or they may not be able to join the study until they speak with a study coordinator by phone, or come and visit the clinic and speak with a study coordinator in person. This is really, really useful when you're enrolling vulnerable or potentially vulnerable populations. And so I would encourage anybody designing an e-consent to use a quiz, and I would encourage you to think very carefully about whether you want it to be a formative or a summative evaluation that you include. So we've just talked about the e-consent part of e-consent, and now we're going to be talking about the long form part of e-consent. So the long form is like the traditional consent form. It often follows or is integrated within e-consent. Participants scroll through and either click to agree or e-sign using their finger or using typing to signal confirmation of their participation. That signed copy can then be printed if you're in person, emailed, and or accessible through a study app or website. And I've seen all of these things happen, and many studies are doing all three of those things. So providing a printed copy if it's in person, or having a print button come up so that people can print, and then emailing participants a signed copy of it, and also having it accessible within the study website. Currently, this long form is broadly interpreted as being required, but I'm not sure. I'm not sure about that because, well, we'll get to it. So when we think about this, it basically breaks all of the things that I was just telling you about e-consent, because here you have a ton of text. It's on a small screen, even if it's been uploaded here, you know, or if it's presented on a tablet or on a website, it's still a ton of information, and people will really struggle to read it. And also, we don't read very well on our phones. So we at SAGE have been trying to think really creatively about the way that we present long forms. For example, one of the ways that we're presenting long forms on our website for app-mediated studies is to have the long form in the panel on the left, and then a little summary to the right with an icon, and then to use that icon at the very end when participants are actually signing to remind them of all of the sections and to link back to the sections that they've reviewed in the long form. I would encourage people to think innovatively about the ways in which long forms can be presented to participants that fulfills our ethical obligation for informing. And to that point, I don't know, honestly, if we still really need a long form when we're doing e-consent. The long form has traditionally served as a central repository for all of the information, right? And participants received a signed copy so that they could keep it and reference it. And these are all good things. But the challenge is that long forms are very, very long and legalistic. Even with all of the work that regulators have done to describe the ways in which we should approach creating a long form, still many people struggle with it. And most Americans struggle or well, I shouldn't say most, many Americans struggle with reading, a very, very large percentage. And so relying on long forms as the repository for all of the information about a study may not actually fulfill our ethical obligation for informing. It may just be ticking a box. And so it's not that I'm saying that there shouldn't be a place where the study is completely described. What I'm saying is, should the sole place where the study is completely described be a long written document? Could we use technology to help us create alternative repositories for all of this information that are more accessible to a greater number of diverse participants? Do we have the long form and also then an auditory version of it? Do we have a long form and then also a video form of it? Does it depend on the population? These are questions that I'm really thinking very actively about right now. So to return back, we've talked about e-consent, we've talked about the long form, and now we're going to talk about privacy policies in terms of service. So privacy policies in terms of service have not traditionally been considered part of the informed consent process. And when you start using e-consent, they have to absolutely to be part of your consent process, because they have very real implications for your consent itself. So if a study has a website or an app or includes any sort of connected tool or device, you need to review the privacy policy in terms of service for that app, website, connected tool, or device, or all of them. Privacy policies generally cover the collection and use of personal information, which means they have direct implications for informed consent. Privacy policies are required by law. Terms of service are not required by law, but they cover the rules of app site and web, apps and website use, like copyright and abuses and allowed uses. All of these can really have important implications for your study. Often they contain exculpatory language, which we know is specifically prohibited, and they may otherwise undermine the terms of the informed consent. Nobody reads. Yes.
Sorry, Megan, it's Yvonne. So just to be clear with this last one, when you refer to you are, my understanding is that you're referring to the investigator when they're designing the consent for this research, right?
Yes, yes. So any person who's designing a study with an e-consent, they need to pay attention to the terms of service or privacy policy of website, app, connected devices, and tools being used in their study. This is essential. Nobody reads these agreements. There was a very funny and terrifying study that was done several years ago where a group of researchers made a fictitious social networking site. And in the fictitious social networking site's privacy policy, they said that you would have to, or terms of service, they said you would have to give up your firstborn child in order to use the social network services, and 98% of people agreed to these terms. So nobody reads these agreements. And these agreements are truly a dumpster fire. They tend to be extremely long, extremely legalistic, very complex, and also difficult to find. They do have real implications for research, though. For example, the All of Us research study is integrating Fitbit data into the study. All of Us is gathering continuous heart rate, exercise, and sleep using Fitbits to act as sensors to gather this data and then uploading it into the All of Us database. So you can imagine that this has really important implications. The way that that data gets from Fitbit to All of Us is through what's called an OAuth. So the OAuth allows for information to be taken from one service and put into another service, in this case, from Fitbit to All of Us. And this is what an OAuth looks like, a typical OAuth looks like. So you can see, you would check and uncheck the different boxes, but there are some here that are really concerning. So unless the investigator spends time to ensure that the OAuth is very clear, that we don't want to know who your friends are, and we don't want to know your location in GPS, for example, we would be getting a lot more information than we wanted. So how do we ensure that people understand the differences between the informed consent for a study and the terms of service and privacy policy of a website, app, and/or device, commercial device or a private device being used in a study? This is an area of ongoing research right now. How do we ensure that people understand the limits of what researchers can control about data use and access for studies using connected tools? For example, if you use a connected device like a Garmin or a Fitbit, that commercial company retains a copy of your data. So you might say in your informed consent for your study, well, we'll keep your study data in, this secure cloud environment, and no one will be able to access it except for these certain people on the study team. But that is not fully true, because a copy of that study data will exist and be part of a commercial company's large data set, which they could then sell or otherwise give away, use however they'd like to, according to their terms of service and privacy policy. And then we come to the question of exculpatory language. So if there's exculpatory language, for example, the device manufacturer may say, we don't take any responsibility if the device causes you a rash. Then it's the study's responsibility to say, if you're wearing this device for our study and you develop a rash, then we will either care for you or not care for you, or you're going to have to use your own insurance. So just important things to really think about as you're moving, as we as scientists are moving into using app-mediated research approaches and or connected tools and devices in our studies. So remember, e-consent, I would argue, is three things. There's the highlight reel, the e-consent, the long form, and then the privacy policy in terms of service. And these three things together should be considered the body of what e-consent is. So the next topic is about knowing your audience. And when we think about using a digital platform to deploy an informed consent process, we really need to think about accessibility and readability. So we all know that there is a major problem with science in that it is so incredibly white. Oscars are white, Grammys are white, but science is also really white. We've seen some shift over the past decade or so, and certainly the All of Us research program is a major effort trying to include more diverse populations in research, but still our databases are extremely, extremely white. So we can't talk about using e-consent in studies without talking about the digital divide and how the digital divide may exacerbate existing disparities in access to research participation. So the Pew Research Center has done a lot of studying of people's access to the internet. You can see here that there are major differences by racial category and ethnic category between who has access to the internet using a desktop or a laptop computer, which is how you would typically access a website, compared to you just having smartphone access alone to the internet. This extends across income as well. So again, there are major disparities in the ways that people access the internet using different devices based on income. And so it's important for us to really think about who's not online, who would we not be able to reach if we relied on people's personal access to the internet. And I want to highlight a few groups here. People who are older than age 65 or 65 and older. 25% of them say they do not use or 27% of them say they do not use the internet. People with less than a high school degree, less than a high school education, 29% of them do not use the internet. And people in rural populations also having very limited use of the internet. So if you're using an e-consent to bring people into your study and you have no other modality, you may be leaving people behind. Now, this is a problem that we've had already in science, right, of leaving people behind. So it might not be any different than the current standard, but we don't want to pile on to a system that we already know isn't sufficient for modern science. So if you rely solely on prospective participants' personal access to the internet, you're going to be leaving people out. And if you optimize your e-consent solely for the web and not for a smartphone, you're also going to be leaving people out. It's really tricky when we think about e-consent and 508 compliance. So e-consent can really be a revolutionary tool for reaching populations with limited mobility or other physical disabilities, like visual impairment or auditory impairment, because the electronic platform allows for many different ways of adaptive technology being used, which is amazing, which is wonderful. You can have audio, voiceover, you can have a text reader. There's a lot of different tools that you can use. And those tools actually can also be helpful for people with low health literacy to read out the e-consent to people, which is wonderful. That said, there's still a digital divide, and the digital divide extends into the disability community. So on the right there, you can see more data from the Pew Research Center looking at people with any disability versus no disability and their difference in access to technology. So really important for us to think about these realities as we design approaches to informed consent for studies. Recruitment and the limits of the internet. So obviously, if you're only using the internet to recruit people, it won't work because you won't be including diverse populations. We need to include diverse populations not only in recruiting, but also in the planning and the development of the informed consent process for research studies. And we need to make sure that we adequately fund this work and give ourselves time to reach out to people if we're really trying to enroll, for example, people over age 65 or people in rural communities. All right, I've been sort of dancing around readability for a while now. Let's talk very seriously about readability. 1 in 5 Americans reads at or below the 5th grade reading level, so at or below the level of an average 10-year-old. 1 in 3 Americans has basic or below basic health literacy, meaning they would have difficulty following directions for a prescription from their physician. So this is really, really a profound statement about how big the disconnect is between traditional informed consent, that written long form, and what people can actually understand and be able to truly comprehend. If we are relying solely on written modalities to express information about research studies, we are not doing our job in reaching all of the different types of people that live here in the United States. Also, it's important to note that people, regardless of their reading level, their reading ability, stress, anxiety, and pain and depression all lower reading comprehension. So if you are consenting someone for a research study in a hospital setting and they are at the bedside of a loved one who is unwell, or they themselves are unwell, they may not be able to read at the level that you would expect. So how do you make it readable? And this is true for e-consent, and this is also true for traditional long forms. No matter what kind of a format you're using for consent, I can't stress enough how important it is for people to make their documents readable or their e-consents readable. It needs to be shortened dramatically. Plain language is essential. You need to actively reduce the reading level, use the active voice. No writing in all caps. People forget that all caps is yelling on the internet, and nobody likes to be yelled at. It doesn't matter what your legal team says. There's no reason ever to use all caps. And then using visual cues like icons, pictures, and videos are really essential supports to help people understand what's going on in a written document or on an e-consent. And then having auditory cues, ideally voiceover or text to voice recognition really, really can help. One of my brilliant collaborators at Yale hired a young adult fiction writer to help him rewrite his e-consent. And I think this is a brilliant idea. So hire yourself a 5th grade English teacher as a consultant or a young adult writer as a consultant and have them take a look at any written materials about your study to help you ensure that it's readable by the audience that you're trying to target. Some of the work that we've done here at SAGE looks at some of the words that people know and don't know. So we did a study it was a mixed method study with people who had an objective reading ability at the 6th grade level or below, many of whom had frank illiteracy. And we presented them with words that are common in different consent forms and different studies. And you can see the list of unknown or unfamiliar words and maybe known words, and then the known and comfortable words. It did my heart good to see DNA in the comfortable category. And when we really dug into that with our participants, sorry. When we dug into this with our participants, they could say things like, you know, DNA is passed down from parents to kids. It's how you know if you're related to somebody. And thanks to CSI, they would say you can be identified at a crime scene using DNA. And that, I think, is a fundamental understanding of what DNA is. And there's no reason for us to use words like genomics or genetic testing information if people really just understand the concept of DNA. Why don't we just use that term and explain things using that term? Here's an example of some of the work that we did on our own consent materials to drop the reading level from the 12th grade level down to the 5th grade level. It takes time and effort, but it's not impossible. And I would strongly encourage you, researchers and others who are working on consents, to take the time to do this work. When it comes to e-consent specifically, we've been structuring our e-consent screens pretty consistently with this format. And it's very specific because of the research that we did prior to designing it. So when words relate to an image, or when an image relates to words, people's reading speed slows down. And when their reading speed slows down, then they're more likely to pick up on information that's important to them. So we have this visual information area at the top of our e-consent screens. We then have a main concept statement that's very concise, and then a very short text information area. And then we have a learn more link that allows people to find out more information if they're interested. And then this navigation instruction area that's very, very clear so that people understand what it is that they're doing on this screen and what the next thing it is that they're going to be doing. The learn more looks a lot like this. So you click on the learn more and then another screen opens up. This can be like a hyperlink, which allows people to learn more information about either a specific word, it might be a definition, or about a specific topic, it might be a topic description. Some IRBs aren't that enthusiastic about learn more. I've had some IRBs say, it feels like you're hiding information from participants. And so one way around that is, instead of having a learn more section, to have a video with closed captioning or some other modality of presenting more detailed information to people other than packing it all into text. So this is an example screen from the All of Us research program. We have that same structure. You can see the main concept, the text information area, and then we have this video with closed captioning, and then there's across the bottom ways to contact the study team, and then a navigation to move them forward. All right, so we've talked about what e-consent is, we've talked about the importance of understanding the limits and the parameters of our audience. What about app-mediated research? What is it, and what are some of the special considerations that you need to think about if you're designing an app-mediated research study, or if you're reviewing an app-mediated research study? So first, what is it? In 2015, Apple launched a platform called ResearchKit, which is an open source platform to enable research applications. Apple did not invent app-mediated research studies. People had been building them on their own using duct tape and string previous to that. But Apple really made it much, much easier for researchers to spin up their own app to allow to support a research study. The equivalent platform on the Android platform, is Research Stack, which is, again, open source, and allows for people to build a research app that people could download from an app store, just like you would any app, and then participate in a research study. So data collection happens in two ways. Through active tasks. So the participant has to consciously do something to trigger data collection, like answering questions in a survey or a patient-reported outcome measure, or do some sort of physical activity like this one that's described here, the spatial memory test, where people tap flowers in order. And then there's also passive data collection, meaning the data is being collected from participants without any conscious steps for the participant. For example, you might be wanting to collect the participant's step count. That doesn't require any conscious work on the part of the participant. The steps just automatically are measured by the phone. They're stored in HealthKit, and then you can get permission from HealthKit to bring over that data into ResearchKit. Or you might be wanting to collect it through some other connected tool like a Fitbit or a Garmin, and then you would be bringing that data directly across. But again, this passive data collection happens without the participant thinking about it. The challenge is that there's a lot, you can gather a lot more data than you want. This slide is super, super old, 2015, but the devices that we have now, I mean, the watch that I wear on my wrist has more sensors in it than my grandfather had to pilot Air Force planes across the South Pacific in World War II. I mean, it's amazing what we've got all around us all of the time. And so it's really important for us to think parsimoniously about data collection when we're thinking about app-mediated research studies or research studies that incorporate connected devices or tools. For example, like the GPS to measure a 6-minute walk test tells you a lot more than if you were in a clinic. So if you're asking people to do a 6-minute walk test, which is a very common clinical test, and they're doing it in the location of their choosing, you might learn a lot more about them and information that the participant doesn't want to necessarily share with you, and information that you as the researcher don't necessarily want to keep, or that you as the IRB reviewing the study doesn't want your researcher to gather. So let's talk about the special considerations here. So I don't know if you all saw this past fall. There was a research study, which was an online survey, which bots cracked into and started completing as quickly as they could. If you're offering an incentive for research participation, you're more likely to attract bots because bots like to make money, or the programmers, they're human programmers, like to make money. But having a robust consent process in advance of your app-mediated research study is an excellent way of deterring bots. Melissa, who is the researcher who had this happen to her and then talked all about it, which was fantastic in this report that she put in Stat News, has some very specific recommendations for ways that you can prevent bots from breaking into your research, but informed consent is one of the first ones. Another thing to think about with app-mediated research studies is data privacy. People are conditioned to respond to alerts on their phone. So if your phone makes noise, you pick it up, and often you address it immediately. So if you're sending an alert to a participant that they need to do some study activity, they may be doing that study activity without thinking in a public place. We had a research study that we were doing, and we had a participant write to us and say, you know, it's really embarrassing to do this vocalization task when I'm out with my family in a restaurant. And we were horrified because obviously we don't want people to be doing study activities in an environment that's public, or that's public that they don't feel comfortable performing those activities in. So you really need to think about what are the risks that the privacy risks that you set up in the design of your study. And then you also need to think about the individual data elements that you're gathering as well. So what are the risks to those data elements individually and then in aggregate? And I strongly would recommend being explicit about which data are collected and when, and also pushing researchers to collect the absolute minimum necessary data set. Scientists love data. I mean, that's what we're trained to want. And so it's very difficult to limit ourselves, but in this digital era, more is not necessarily better. Speaking of more not being better, data security. So for app-mediated research, we really need to think about how data are collected and safeguarded. Obviously, you're not storing them in a locked cabinet in a locked room any longer, so data need to be encrypted in transit and at rest. There need to be redundant systems that can detect data tampering. And I would really, really strongly recommend that you employ, as a researcher, employ experts, ask questions, and disclose information in your informed consent to your participants about the ways in which their data will be safeguarded, and be very specific. Finally, one more thing to think about with app-mediated research is the inclusion of bystanders. So who else might the data that you're collecting implicate? For example, if you have a vocalization task, you would pick up perhaps vocalization of other people in the background. If you're using a camera, you might pick up pictures of other people. So how do we minimize bystander data collection? Is there a way for it to be scrubbed? How do we protect vulnerable populations, especially children? And again, this comes back to the minimum necessary data set, talking to engineers about the sensors that you're wanting to use from the phone or connected device or technology. And then, of course, the importance of disclosing this in your informed consent. Just as you're thinking about all of these things, think about e-consent in an app-mediated study. Obviously, there are huge benefits to it because it's scalable and it's computable, meaning the informed consent can follow the data. It may support participant autonomy, and it may support participant informedness because of multimodality engagement opportunities. But there's a lot of risks, like it being an entirely remote setting, if you choose that, a lack of standardization, the regulatory questions around protections for these data, and then lack of anonymity. Okay. A couple of case examples. The Parkinson's Empower study. So when ResearchKit launched in 2015, there were 5 initial apps. 2 of them were led by Sage. All 5 of them actually had technologies that undergirded them that were supported by Sage. So we basically built the back end, the data collection and housing tools. But only 2 of the apps were the ones that we led ourselves. These 5 apps in the first month garnered 60,000 participants, which is amazing. So let me tell you about Parkinson's Empower. We wanted to collect data about people's experience with Parkinson's disease. So the study included people who self-identified as having a diagnosis of Parkinson's disease and people who self-identified as healthy controls. The way that people joined the study was downloading the free app from the App Store, giving consent, performing tasks. They could then look at their own data, and those data were then used to make discovery. We had a free text field where participants were able to give us comments about their experience participating in the research study. What we found was some really, really beautiful data. Participants like this one, I feel like I'm helping to reach an overall outcome. I don't have Parkinson's, but I'm happy to participate in the study if it helps to find help for those who have it. So really, really beautiful things. Exactly what we want, this beautiful altruistic joining of a research study. So here are some of the tasks that we ask people to do: a gait and balance activity and a spatial memory activity. So using the phone, you would put the phone in your pocket and you'd walk 20 steps. For the gait and balance test, for the spatial memory, it's these flowers that light up in a pattern, and then you have to tap in that same pattern. And people got to look at their data. and we asked them what they thought. And what we found was that they made their own observations, which was incredible, right? This is exactly what we want. They were engaged in science. So ask if the pants or shorts are tight or not, because I had my phone in loose pants and the range for gait was very small, but in tight pants, it was very big. So they're observing things in the field and they're sharing their observations with us. And this is a form of reciprocal engagement in science, which is tremendous. Time of day affects performance, irregardless of medication. So this is probably a person who self-reports Parkinson's disease, because we asked if they were doing their activity before or after medication. Memory activity better in the morning after coffee. A nice observation there. You might be one of the ones who falls into this category. Not good to do memory activity at night after wine. And then this happened. So we had thousands and thousands of participants join, and you can see this very dramatic drop-off, this hockey stick drop-off in participation over time. So while app-mediated research studies are outstanding at bringing in all kinds of people and getting them to participate for a little while, there can be very dramatic drop-off if you're not engaging with people over time. So why did our participants drop out? Doing this is a lot of work. Send us an email now and then to let us know how it's going. That is a lot of work. We were asking them to do tasks a few times a day. If you depend on us to partner with you in research, it would be good to give us feedback. Could you provide a summary trends report in plain language? They called us out. They called us out as the research team that we were not being good partners to them. This was very powerful to hear. So we put together this little plain language summary about the participants, who they were and how many tasks they were doing, their age range, who had Parkinson's and who didn't self-report Parkinson's. And then we started getting love letters from them. They were so thrilled. They also made more suggestions to us. So one suggestion is an incentive program. Incorporate tangible goals and visual reward, either through points or badges. Establish goals for members so that they can accomplish each task in a certain time for bonus rewards. Okay. It would probably mess up your double-blind nature or privacy, this participant writes, but it's my experience that those of us with Parkinson's will often show up and be more consistent when we're involved in a group rather than as individuals because of our inherent lethargy and apathy. So their knowledge of their community, symptoms of my disease are lethargy and apathy, and they're suggesting make it a team activity because that will help us participate more. That's powerful insight. And then we had this, make everything a game, make it fun and interactive. So we've heard about, like, you know, having a team. We've heard about having badges. Now this person is just saying straight up, make it like a game. Even though kids are the ones who are supposed to be playing games to learn, it makes it easier for adults too. So here's the question. You know, when we designed the study, our technology team said we really had to make it more like a game. And when we got this feedback, they said, told you so. We told you it had to be more like a game. And so we were between a rock and a hard place. And then we saw data like this. The memory questions get hard very quickly. It is hard on the ego. I just feel like if I forget to complete the study activities, it's going to make me feel even worse that I have Parkinson's disease. And then this one, I'm going to quit this program. I don't like having to go through all these symptoms that I don't have yet. I don't want to think about what may be coming. And this is very important for us as researchers to remember. We love playing with our phones, but when we use the phone as a research platform, we need to never, ever forget that what we're doing has profound implications, not only for science, but also for the individuals who selflessly are giving their time and effort to aid in our data collection. In our e-consent, here's what we told people. Issues to consider. Participating in this study could generate a wide range of emotions. And in the Learn More section, participating in the study may change how you feel. You may feel tired, sad, energized, or happy. Participation in this study may involve risks that are not known at this time. You may be told about new information that will change your decision. You'll be told about any new information that will change your decision to be in this study. So this is what we told people, and this is what they experienced, or some of them experienced. And the question that we have is, was this sufficiently informing? People were wanting us, other participants were wanting us to make it more like a game. You know, where is that balance point between engaging people and making sure that they stay part of the study so that we gather this important data so that we can make scientific discoveries and make good on our promises to participants that we're going to advance our understanding of different diseases, with the very real risks that participants take to their self-identity or to their self-benefit in participating. So a little bit of a heavy end to that story, but really important for us to think. All right, a second case example of app-mediated research, or well, I should say e-consent, the All of Us research study. So All of Us, I'm sure many of you are very familiar with it. It's an NIH's million-person 10-year longitudinal cohort study. Enrollment targets are based on 2040 census projections. Ooh, third time. There's a single IRB. We've got about 400 enrollment sites. We have about 300,000 participants so far. About 80% of participants are from one or more underrepresented groups, and more than half of them are non-white participants. So this is, again, moving the needle on science being so white. The program has core values, and these core values help guide the informed consent, specifically transparency, participant empowerment through access to information, and respecting participant preferences were really at top of mind when we were designing the consent process for the program. The All of Us informed consent is modular. The primary consent has an overview of all the program activities, there's a HIPAA authorization, and then there's the return of genomic results. And so there's an e-consent, a quiz, and a long form. There's also a privacy policy in terms of service that are all incorporated together as part of this consenting process. And so we used 5th grade language, we used short videos. So the primary informed consent has a series of 15 to 30-second videos that highlight different aspects of participation. And then people answer questions. And what we found is that more than 90% of people can answer key questions about the study after completing the e-consent and the consent process. For example, people could correctly answer that the study was voluntary, that they could withdraw at any time, that we would be accessing sensitive information in their electronic medical records. They could correctly identify the purpose of the study and distinguish it from medical care. So this is a really big success, data that we're really, really excited about. We've looked at it by education level and also by self-reported income, and the data are very consistent, which is really, really wonderful. So today I have talked about what e-consent is, about thinking about your audience for e-consent, about the different things to think about with app-mediated research, and I've walked us through a couple of case examples of e-consent in real life. As a little reminder, an overview comparing traditional informed consent to e-consent, the environment can be different or the same. The format can be different, and I would strongly encourage you to take advantage of the opportunities afforded by e-consent to have additional multimedia integrated into it. The geographic reach of your study may be different. It can be difficult to verify identity or inclusion criteria if there's no in-person visit, and so you need to design carefully around that. Addressing participant questions can be done remotely by phone or chat or email or in person for e-consent, whereas it's traditionally done just in person for regular consent or traditional consent. verification of understanding, strongly encourage the inclusion of a quiz, and then the record of consent. There are a number of different ways to get people out. For takeaway reminders, for the love of all that is holy, please do not just take your long form and put it online. That is not e-consent. Think about your setting, consider your audience, be creative, distill the information you're presenting, watch out for terms of service and privacy policies that may undermine your informed consent, be intentional about data security and privacy, choose the right quiz for your study, and watch out for bonus data collection. For more information, SAGE has this free compendium of information that we've gathered about e-consent. This is basically serves as our institutional marker of what we've learned. We update it about every 6 months, and so I would encourage you to visit SAGE's Elements of Informed Consent and see for yourself. And then some papers that we've published with colleagues and collaborators around the country and around the world about the use of e-consent in research. And with that, I want to thank again all of my wonderful colleagues at SAGE, including the folks on the governance team, most especially. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Megan. This is Yvonne again. I'd like to thank you and all your wonderful colleagues as well for getting this, as you've noted, that your colleagues behind you are also people who have been involved in making this presentation a success, obviously. I have one comment and maybe one question, and then I think we can also open the floor to my colleagues if they have comments and questions as well. So my first comment is I really appreciate you emphasizing the point about, engaging the participants. I think your point about us or researchers being able to learn so much from their participants, and it really pays for people to spend the time and the effort to learn about their target population, the people whom they intend to recruit for their research, before they actually embark on recruiting them. Yeah. I think that there's a lot to be said about that, and it's also in terms of, like you said, in terms of, designing the research, it's definitely useful, but also in terms of subsequently making sure that they continue to stay in the research, right? Because after all, that is essential, and it's not just initial recruitment. I also want to say how, what you said earlier when you were talking about Empower, how some of the things that the feedback that you received from the participants actually form some of the information that you provide. And I was thinking about how, wow, this kind of like corresponds to what the revised common rule said about the reasons why one might or might not want to participate. So for example, you mentioned how, by participating in this research, you could go through some of these, happy days and not so happy days because might remind you. Yeah. And that's really poignant, I think. So I just want to say that as a comment. And my question is simple and relates to the last bit. So if one was a researcher thinking about, I really like what I've heard, and I think that, I have a research that might be, suitable for using e-consent, at least for a certain group of populations. But I have, not done this before. Yeah. What might be some of the recommendations and suggestions that you would give to this researcher or these researchers to at least, get the hang of, or, to consider, whether they need more training, or how can they think about this more before they embark on it?
Yeah. So the SAGE's Elements of Informed Consent that I mentioned, our online repository of all of our knowledge about e-consent, I would strongly encourage people to use that compendium. It's a great primer to bring people up to speed about what is e-consent and what are the things to think about. There are GitHub repositories of the designs for e-consent that SAGE developed for ResearchKit, and they're also available on Research Stack, so on the Android platform. So if you have a programmer or if you have a programming background and you'd like to go to the GitHub repo, you can find those resources available to you there, and then you can use them yourself and adapt them to your own study. So there are open source frameworks for you to build off of. One thing that researchers struggle with a little bit is the design of the whole thing. And I would, again, really encourage you to either talk with a children's book writer or talk with somebody who's a user design experience expert to help create something that is easily navigable and easily understood by participants, because you want it to be easy and seamless, but you don't want it to be frictionless. And I think that's I think one of the challenging points is that most of our interactions on the internet are designed to be frictionless, to be as easy as possible. You click one button and then the next day the package arrives on your doorstep with the thing that you want. And we don't want research participation to be frictionless. Like, friction is one of the key components. We want people to slow down and think as they're joining a study. But we do want the experience to be easy and seamless. So that's the sweet spot that you're aiming for as a researcher designer.
Navigable.
Yeah, navigable, for sure.
So I have my colleagues here. Anybody would have any comments and questions? Yes, do you want to come closer, maybe?
For any of the 5 studies that you talked about, were you able to collect data about how many people opened up the e-consent form and then didn't decide to participate in the research study?
So that's a really good question. So, so we know the number of downloads of the Research Kit apps, and we know the number of people who have joined the studies. But we very intentionally did not collect any data about any person prior to them signing the consent and officially joining the study. So none of their quiz information, none of the number of pages that they viewed or the time that they spent on those pages for those original 5. When we were designing the e-consent process for the All of Us research program, in consultation with our IRB, they said we would actually like for you to track information over time to see if there is a particular place where people start to drop out, if there are differences in demographics, in people getting questions right and wrong on the quiz, differences in the ways that people enroll, because we have these very important standards for enrollment, and we want to ensure that the e-consent is not differentially impacting enrollment. And so for the All of Us research study, we actually do have those data. And what we find is that once people start the consent process, then there's about a 1 to 2 to 3% drop off per page as people navigate through, which is pretty standard. You know, like, people are going through and they might get distracted or lose interest or decide it's not for them. There is a more distinctive drop off at the point of signature. So people generally get all the way through, they answer the quiz questions, and then we see a more significant drop off. I think it's between 7 and 9% before the actual signature. It's hard to say whether that's the right amount of drop off or not, but at least there is some, it seems as if people are taking a moment and some people are saying, you know what, this is not for me. But we have no objective standard to know how many people we should be losing at that point. So it's a little tricky.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, Megan, this is Jaime, and a follow-up to Ivor's question. And I don't want to use All of Us as an example, but if other institutions in the future, e-consent sort of like picks up, I mean, it becomes something that is broadly used, and there are other developers that are not Sage Bionetworks, out there for a profit on the market of e-consent. Shouldn't there be some kind of like consent to consent? Like, shouldn't the participants know the information that is being collected about them while doing informed consent? And
yes.
And who has access to that, and what is going to happen to that information?
Yes, I would strongly agree with that. And in the All of Us research program, we have a screen that says we're collecting this type of information, and we're using it. It's not associated with your identity, but we're going to use it to make sure that we're not creating, discriminatory. We're not having a discriminatory enrollment process. But yes, I would strongly encourage any commercial entity to also disclose what data that they would collect prior to the moment of signature to signal that people are joining the study.
I mean, related to that also was how, there was an interruption earlier on when you were talking about, the terms of conditions, and that the investigators themselves actually, whatever apps that they're using to collect the information or to conduct e-consent, that at least they themselves need to, have almost like a responsibility to read through and understand the terms of conditions before actually employing that platform.
Yes. Yeah, for sure. Yeah. It's absolutely essential due diligence, and it's due diligence on the part of the overseeing IRB. They absolutely need to push researchers to understand and disclose, and it's absolutely a requirement of researchers. They really need to understand what specific data are being collected. For example, when it comes to the walking test for the Parkinson's Empower study, we needed to measure how far people had walked. And our developers said, we'll just use GPS. It's a great way of determining how far somebody has gone. Well, GPS gives us far more information than we want to collect. You do not want to know people's GPS location. You don't want to know if they're walking to their mistress's house or to the local fast food place. Like, that's none of your business. And so you really need to think about displacement vectors and other ways of gathering that information so that you're not taking more than you should be to conduct your research. Because it's the problem in traditional research has always been, up until this point, has always been, if only we had collected that field, we would be able to answer this question. Now we're faced with the opposite problem. We're collecting far, far too much data, and we erode public trust in research if we don't carefully construct the variables that we collect and treat them with great sensitivity and very, very carefully justify their use in our research.
Again, I mean, thank you for emphasizing that, because I just can see how difficult it is to change that kind of a habit, right?
Yes.
Because I think it happens to all of us, not just researchers, right? Yeah. I mean, there's a tendency to want to have more data, just as we have a tendency to want to have more money. It always have to be like, you have to change your thinking about this and just really treat data as something like hot buttons, right? Almost like, if you don't want it, it's better not to collect it or store it. But it's so hard. Yeah. Anybody has anything that they want to comment on? Faye?
I had a question. Hi, Megan. It's Julie.
Hey, Julie.
Just wanted to, I guess, follow up on a question you had raised in your presentation about the continued need for the long form.
Yeah.
And I wanted to just explore that more with you, because I'm not sure exactly what you mean by posing the question, and whether it's a regulatory question that you were asking about whether it's appropriate that the regulations require a long form, which they might not, or whether you think it's the way that the regulations are being implemented that you think might be more of the problem.
Yeah, so I think that it's the way that the regulations are being interpreted by IRBs. So I have yet to see an IRB that's game to try not having a long form or having alternatives to the long form. All of the IRBs that I've interacted with are still very fixated on saying, this is the official record of consent. This is the single document. This, in the absence of all other materials, this is it. And I am hoping that we can shift away from that interpretation to focus, I think, much more on the spirit of the regulations, and certainly the spirit of the regulations as they were clarified with the update to the common rule, which is, it is our responsibility as researchers to ensure that we provide materials to prospective participants and to our participants that helps them in their personal decision-making, their informed decision-making about their autonomous decision-making about research participation, and serves as, for them, a record of having joined that study and what that study is about. And I don't think that the written form is necessarily the ideal single repository. And I don't feel like it should be this gold standard that nobody questions, right? That's inconsistent. Does that make sense?
It does. I guess I have a follow-up then to that,
Yeah.
just to make sure I'm following what you're describing as what's occurring. So are you saying that in circumstances where e-consent is being used, there then is actual written sort of in-paper document that then is also provided, or is perhaps provided electronically,
Yes.
but in a different kind of format, in the more traditional, long form, paper-based format that subjects are then also asked to sign?
So the long form in e-consent is, the way I've seen it most often is that a paper version of the long form gets uploaded into a digital format, and there is a field for a participant to either type their signature, finger sign their signature, click a box to signal their participation. And then this is PDF'd up, packaged up as if it was a paper document, and is either printed and presented to the participant or emailed to the participant, or lives in a website or app for the research study and is referred to as the official record of participation, and is considered to be sufficient for participants to carry away with them as the description of what they've just joined. But if you have an e-consent, which enables the participation of a person who's illiterate, and through videos and voiceover presents information to that participant in a way that they can understand, and then they make an autonomous decision to join, and then you hand them or give them only a paper thing with writing on it as a record of their participation, then they don't have a functional record of their participation. They need access to that e-consent that helped them understand what the study was about. And they need, within that e-consent, there should be some way for them to signal their participation, their participation that's not having to be appended to a long written document that they can't understand.
Thank you. That helps.
Thank you, Julie. Yeah, great question. Yeah.
I want to follow this a little bit further.
Yeah.
Have you looked to see how many or how much of the required elements of informed consent in the regulations get covered in the e-consent?
Yeah, so we actually did a systematic review of all of the apps that were available. I think we closed data collection in 2017. We've published this. And we looked at the variability in e-consents across all of the apps that were available at the time. And there was significant variability. So some e-consents were like, I would say like Sage's, very detailed, including all of the required elements. Others were very perfunctory. And so in the absence of any guidance or any standardization of what's required from an e-consent, it's hard to make a statement that says e-consent could substitute for a long form as a general blanket statement, although there are, I think, are many examples. For example, the All of Us research program, whose e-consent is quite detailed, where it might make sense to say, well, this e-consent actually could stand alone. It does cover all of these different elements.
Because that's, that would be one way, certainly from a regulatory standpoint.
Yeah.
That would be one way to push back at the long form to say, I have already accomplished the communication of all the information that the regulations require.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, and provided that it remains accessible
Right.
after the fact.
Yeah,
those are the main criteria, that you have all the elements of informed consent covered in how you present it. You don't have to, I don't think that the regs say anything about you have to present it in the order that they listed. And in any case, I believe that, we've been going around, telling people about informed consent, that you can, make it, use innovative ways to, put in the context, make sure that people understand things in that manner, right? So, and that you don't, where it says risks and benefits, you probably shouldn't even list the risks just as list, right? Because sometimes when it's such a long list, nobody can understand what it really means. Yeah. So it's kind of related to what you were saying, but yeah.
Just, a very low level sort of technical question. When somebody goes through e-consent, they finished, right? Can they still use the same app to go back through the e-consent if they want to remind themselves of what they were told?
So this is very variable across all of the app-mediated research studies or e-consent-mediated research studies that I've seen. So some research studies have a website, and you can go and you can review the consent as many times as you'd like to, after you've joined, before you've joined. It's accessible to anyone, the e-consent. Others, you complete the e-consent and then you're into the study, and you can only go back and see your long form. And so that's, I think, one of the challenges there is, to make sure that if you were to attempt to shift away from the long form, which I would argue is something that we should be trying to do, we would need to make accessible this e-consent, and also some way of signaling to the participant that they, when they agreed to this and that they agreed to it.